And now it is a pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker. How many of you have ever seen the Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg HBO series, The Band of Brothers? Okay? Oh my. Probably 85% of you. When I had the good fortune to travel into Europe about a month ago, and I was actually at Bastogne, Belgium, to the Battle of the Bulge. I actually got to visit the foxholes of the 101st Airborne, Easy Company. And then the very night I came home from that trip, you know, I got this little thing called Chautauqua coming up, and I checked my messages. And lo and behold, I had a message from Herb Surth. And what an absolute thrill it was that he was from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's 88 years young, and he came all the way to beautiful Greensburg, Indiana, one of the actual Easy Company soldiers, to share his story. Please give him a nice round of applause. I think we're good.
All right, so then your Hungarian is pretty good.
After all the wonderful, wonderful talks that I heard this afternoon, and the personal experiences and the horrific, horrific abuses that the people suffered under the Nazi regime, it makes me feel good to know that myself and all the guys in E Company and the 101st and the American Army, we knew a little bit about what we were fighting for. But even now, today, 66 years later, I have a much deeper understanding of the abuses and the things that happened. Sure, I've read it, I've talked about it and seen it in the movies and all that, but when you hear women up here that were taken away from their parents and they're stripped, all of their dignity just torn away from them, you realize that we were fighting for a good cause. But unfortunately, none of us really knew what it was like. We had no idea that these camps existed. I was wounded just before we took the first camp. And my platoon leader, who's still alive today, Ed Shames, works for the DIA. He goes to Fort DeMede every day. He works. He's 88 years old. And he's now made some 55 trips to the Middle East. And he was the first man in 101st to go into Bergen-Belsen, I think it was. I mispronounced that, but forgive me. He saw and verified to our regimental commander the horrific stories and rumors that were coming back, because the regimental commander, Colonel Sink, had said, Ed, I want you to go up there and find out what all this stuff is. I'm not believing when I'm hearing. So Ed went up, and as I said just a little earlier in a smaller group, just recently I was talking to Ed, and we have maintained contact for 66 years. And I see him once in a while, and I talk to him a lot. And he said to me, Herb, I'll never forget going into that camp. This is just about 2 months ago he said this. And he said, I still smell it every day, every night when I go to bed. So we knew, unfortunately, fortunately too, that I never got there, but I think I've heard enough to know that everything that was said was probably words can't describe the agonies and the difficulties of what went on, and those, the dignity of the people was so violated, so, okay. Well, first of all, I know if I ever run for office, I have a good campaign manager. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you this evening. My tenure with the 101st was relatively short. I came from England in late November of 1944, and in 3 weeks we were up into Bastow. And all the details of how that happened, but those of us in the Army called it Roosevelt's Thanksgiving. So it had been I think it didn't suit with the calendar somehow or other, so they changed it anyhow. Just quickly, a little biography of myself. I'm a born and raised Chicago kid, and I was a product of all Catholic high schools, rather grammar school, high school, and college. I graduated from Marquette University in 1950 with a degree in mechanical engineering, and have made my living at that with that particular skill. And for those of you that are still students and so forth, get a skill. Finish your schooling. Get every bit of schooling you can. If you go in service and you come home, use the GI Bill. They can't take your education away from you. And it's provided me with a very good income through my lifetime. And we had 9 kids. I have 15 grandchildren. So they've all gone to college, and the grandchildren are now all almost graduated from college. So in an hour it's going to be a little difficult to cover a lot of the things that happened to me and so forth. First, I think I'll tell you just a little bit about how Band of Brothers happened. First of all, it was not a product of Hollywood. The Band of Brothers existed before Hollywood ever thought about it. We were a group of guys. I came in very late in the joining the company, but most of the company had been in training for 2 solid years before they ever went to combat. Every man knew everyone else, knew their families, knew their kids, read one another's mail when someone didn't get mail. It was that cohesive a group. Now you can imagine in combat how that was. I mean, they knew how one another thought, they trusted one another, and that's what made us the company that we were. In June of this year, I had the privilege of being present to dedicate a monument on Utah Beach to our company commander. And before that, the Assistant Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Security had preceded me on the podium. And they were extolling the great things we did as a company. And it was very embarrassing to me, because in the audience were hundreds of guys who had made D-Day on the beaches, and the 82nd had jumped in, and I'm thinking, oh my Lord, you know, we didn't win the war. I mean, we were just one good rifle company. But we never lost the battle, period. That was it. They retreated once, and the guys really didn't want to do that, but they thought it was the best, so they dropped back about a mile and went back the next day. How did the Band of Brothers really happen? Why did all of this stuff take place and we end up to be the rock stars of World War II? And I quote unquote, I humbly say that, but unfortunately that's what's happened. We had no control over it, none at all. My guy in my squad family lived in a place called Pass Christi, Louisiana. Guess who else lived there? Stephen Ambrose. They were family friends. And Stephen decided he was going to write a book about D-Day, and the end result of it was he came to one of our reunions, and after 2 days of interviewing of all the guys who had made D-Day, they decided to write a book. And that book was Band of Brothers. And that's all it was. In the 50th, he published that book for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And the rest is almost history. It's sort of happenstance of things that occurred. After the book was published, the movie Saving Private Ryan was in production. Two of our guys, pardon me, were asked to come as technical directors. And in talking with them, talking with Spielberg and Hanks, they told him, they kept saying to him, you know, you guys ought to do something. We are still a functioning group. We just came, in fact, just here 3 weeks ago, I just came from my 66th reunion of E Company. That's how close we are, even today. So they kept saying to Hanks and Spielberg, why don't you do something with this? Because here's the book, it's been written by Ambrose, it was a bestseller, it was everything. And so finally they started to listen, and hence the HBO series. The HBO series is relatively accurate. The book was relatively accurate. There were a couple mistakes in it, and I'll recount a personal experience that I know of. It didn't involve me, but I knew of it. In the book was a mention of the fact of a guy by the name of Shifty Powers. Those of you who have read the book and seen the series know Shifty. He was my squad leader, a Cherokee Indian, full-blooded, and in the book it said that Shifty refused to go on a patrol on Christmas Eve. And by the way, Christmas Eve was a real bad day for the Krauts. Excuse me if any of you who are German. German is one thing, Krauts are another. They wore the wrong color uniform and we killed them. So that sounds a little cold-blooded, but if you don't think like that, you don't live very long. So anyhow, Shifty had been asked by Lieutenant Shames, Ed Shames, my platoon leader, to go on a patrol. And Shifty said to Ed, I haven't had anything to eat all day, Lieutenant. Can I just stop and get something to eat? Because it was Christmas Eve, and we had just had a major attack by the Krauts, and there were a lot of dead and partly dead guys out in the woods. We weren't sure exactly where we were from a defense position, and it was one of the first major attacks that we had by an infantry group, and they came out second best on that. I think they left 28 dead, and they were wearing snowsuits in the dark woods. It was like shooting ducks in a pond, you know. Sad, sad. Anyhow, Shifty said, I need to get something to eat, Lieutenant. Well, Stephen Ambrose translated that into Shifty refused to go on a patrol. Well, those of you who have had contact with full-blooded Indian folks realize that honor is a very sacred thing within the tribes, and Shifty was a full-blooded Cherokee Indian. So he sent his books back to Ambrose. He refused to come to any of our reunions for about 3 years. We couldn't get Shifty to come because he was just so distraught about what was published. Remember, the book is a bestseller, so it's sold, you know, hundreds of thousands of copies, and Shifty's name is in there with bad information. Well, right as the movie was about to be produced and they were gathering all the information, I had the pleasure of getting a call from Tom Hanks. And he started out the conversation with you don't mind if I call you Junior? And I said, no, no, Tom. I mean, that was my nickname in the outfit. And I said, you know, most of the guys had a lot worse nicknames than that. You know, there was one lung and no shoulders and, you know, well, all kinds of crazy names. So Junior was, and how I got that was, I was a junior, and it was on my dog tag, so I couldn't avoid it. There was a Herbert J. Seward living back in Chicago. It was my dad. So anyhow, in talking with Tom, he said to me, we had a nice conversation. He said, what's with all these nicknames, Herb? And I said, well, or Junior, he said. And I said, well, as I can remember, and I'm thinking about it, Tom, it was because passwords and countersigns, and those of you who have been in the Army and in places where you use passwords and countersigns, were, you could forget them real easy in the heat of battle and day to day. You know, one day it'd be the New York Yankees and Joe DiMaggio was the countersign, the next day it'd be New York, Chicago, or something like that. And if you didn't remember them, if you said the wrong countersign on the wrong day, you're liable to get shot. So I explained to Tom, but everyone had a nickname, and that nickname was they used it when you were crawling around in the snow at night and going on patrol or something, and you'd go out and you'd be coming up to a foxhole where the outpost was, and you gave that, you know, hey, it's Junior, or it's no shoulders, or it's one lung, or it's all crazy Popeye, skinny Sisk. They just went on and on. So I explained that to Tom, and we had a nice conversation. And then he said to me, Junior, is there anything I can do for you? And I said, yeah. You can ask Stephen Ambrose to change the book. And he said, oh, yeah, I heard all about that. And I said, well, Tom, that's all I'm asking of you is to do that. That was in October of, I don't know, 1999 or something. And he came, that Christmas Eve, Stephen Ambrose called Shifty Powers' house, and we apologized for that, and the book was subsequently changed. Now that's the kind of guy Tom Hanks is. If you've seen him, I've had the pleasure of talking to him, not a lot of times, but the most recent was my wife and I had the pleasure of riding in a car, I mean in a train from Paris to Normandy for 2.5 hours. So that was a lot of time considering the stature of the guy we had. But you know, you see him you see him in the movies, you see him on TV appearances. As I say to people, what you see with Tom is what you get. He is just absolutely down to earth. And I probably wouldn't be standing here today if he and his wife hadn't sent a check of about $17,000 to E Company to start the association nonprofit Men of Easy Company. And subsequently now we've been in existence now for about 12 years. Prior to that, it was only our own efforts that kept the company together, and a guy by the name of Bill Garnier really kept the company together in those early years. And you know, it was just amazing. One time we were in New York, and someone said, "Where's Ed Shames?" And I said, "God, I don't know." Gave him a notice. Why isn't he here? So they called his office. I think we got a hold of his wife. She said, "Oh, he's in Cuba buying cattle for his company that he worked for." So we got on the phone from New York, found him in Cuba, and the next day he was on a plane. Next day he was up in New York, and I think that was the first reunion that we had with Ed in a number of years after the war. So what I'm trying to fit in the things that I think you folks would be interested in. I remember I had just joined the company. I'd been in them about 3 weeks, Now remember, all these other guys have been together for 2 years. They had made 2 combat jumps together. And here I was, a replacement, and I didn't know how that was going to go. Well, they evidently needed replacements pretty badly, because my initial tenure into E Company was I was pretty well received. I mean, not with open arms or anything, but I had the luck of bunking next to Earl McClung, One Lung McClung. And Earl happened to be, among other things, the best shot in the company. And I can testify that because I buried a crowd on Christmas Day that had been shot twice, both times in the chest. One was two holes in his chest and one in his hand. So when he had been shot, he came like that. Mac shot him again, and the 2 shots were within inches of one another. And that was the kind of marksmanship that some of the fellas had. So it was pretty devastating when, and the Krauts knew that. They always remarked about how well the riflemen, and particularly in the airborne companies, when they shot, they usually didn't miss. I will never forget the night. I had been in the company about 3 weeks and done some training and squad training and all those kinds of things. The weather was miserable in northern France at Marmolon-le-Grand outside of Reims. And I had asked to go to, everyone was going to Paris, and I knew that was no way in heck I was going to get a pass to Paris because they only had so many of them. So I said, can I go to Reims, because I'd like to see the Reims Cathedral, and I'm Roman Catholic and practice my religion. And I thought it would be pretty neat if I could go to Reims Cathedral and go to midnight mass. It'd be something I could talk about later on. So Buck Taylor said, sure. Well, unfortunately, on the night of the 17th of December, Buck Taylor, our platoon sergeant for the 3rd Platoon, the same platoon that Ed Shames commanded, and Shifty was in, and McClung was in, and Popeye was in, and One Lung McClung, all of them, they were all in the 3rd Platoon. And Buck came in and he said, we're going up. Didn't even know what that meant. Well, what it meant was we were going back into combat. And all the guys would start running around, and not many people had their weapons. They had all been turned in after being 70 days in combat in Holland. They had all been turned in, and machine guns were missing, mortar equipment was gone, and everyone is scrambling around because they knew once we got into the line, you were probably never going to get anything to speak of. So we were scrambling for ammunition, for everything that you could get. And I have a friend of mine who was in another regiment of 401. He went up to combat in Bastogne with a trench knife. That was all he had. There were the weapons. I don't know why we couldn't get. I had a weapon when I came from England, but a lot of the guys had given their weapons up because they were, after 70 days in combat and mud and water and everything, getting infiltrate. It was really bad news. Well, we got into the trucks to go to Bastogne, and I think everyone in this audience has seen a green truck. Well, they loaded a whole company of us. No, not a company. I mean a platoon of us, with all of our equipment in one green truck. And it somewhat reminded me now, as I was listening in the audience today, how we were packed in. That was what you folks that were sent away to camps and so forth were packed in. We couldn't fall over. We were shoulder to shoulder. We had all of our equipment with us. It was raining, it was snowing, it was drizzling, and it was fog. And we got in these trucks and they took off following almost bumper to bumper at fairly high speeds, and came around corners where you couldn't fall down. There was no way of falling down. So got into Bastogne, and this is something that, as I was speaking to some military groups, and I said, I hope you never have to see what we in E Company and the guys in the 101st saw that first couple hours in Bastogne. We saw the American Army in retreat, total retreat. It looked like Washington at Valley Forge, honest to God, guys with bandages, using a rifle for a crutch, no ammunition, no overcoats, no nothing. They were just running. And right behind them, you could hear brr, brr, brr. And that was my first taste of what they called a burp gun. And that was the machine pistol that was so deadly with the Germans. And I had asked someone about, I said, what's a burp gun sound like? One of them turned to me and he said, you'll know when you hear it. And sure enough, boy, the first time I heard it, out of the fog. And you remember, you couldn't see more than 100 feet when we got out of those trucks that night. And we knew that we were going to run into the Krauts immediately. Well, what happened was that they evidently realized that at that point we had superiority because of the number of people concentrated in one place. And they withdrew. So we were able to go into dig our foxholes in Bastogne. And that's what one of those foxholes, my foxhole is still there. It's been disfigured because a whole bunch of reenactors and stuff got in it and wasn't big enough for them and so they, but when I first went there in 1979, because I was in Europe for a son that was being married, my foxhole was absolutely intact. Intact. It was about 2 feet deep rather than the 4 feet or 4.5 feet that I had dug it. And I knew exactly where it was because I stood in it and I could see a barn across the way that was one of the markers of it and so forth. So at that point, well, let's see now, I speak extemporaneously with no notes and sometimes I get, anyhow, can anyone tell me where I was? Aha, you weren't listening. Okay. Anyhow, that foxhole is still there today, but it's really disfigured, and I think someone verified that. Time?
You're good.
Okay. I'm not going to get cut off.
You got plenty of time.
Okay, good enough. So and I'm sort of rambling and going around, and not in circles, but things that I think you'd like to hear. Go and I'll skip the foxhole business at this moment, and I'll say, how did this whole thing, how did it happen that this company of 140 guys, actually 240 went through the company from D-Day to VE Day. We had, the first thing that happened was that Stephen Ambrose and a fellow by the name of Walter Gordon's family were all friends in Pass Christi, Louisiana. So Stephen came to one of our reunions. They took a lot of notes. They videoed a lot of stuff. And when they came out of the meeting, Ron Diaz, who is now still alive and is running Stephen Ambrose tours, said to Stephen Ambrose, you know, there's enough material here for a book. That's how the Band of Brothers book took place. It happened. And then all these other things. 10 years went by. The book was, I think it was in 5th or 7th publication. 2 of our guys were called by the Hollywood by Playtone to come and act as technical consultants for Saving Private Ryan, which they did. While they were there, they talked to Ambrose, not Ambrose, but Hanks and Spielberg, and kept saying to them, you know, why don't you do something with, so many of us are still alive and we can tell you the stories the way they are. And they listened. Hollywood listened. I can't even believe it, you know. And the movie came out, and really, it is relatively accurate. There's some Hollywood in it, but not a lot. And one thing that I apologize to all of you for, there were some in the outfit that used a lot of four-letter words, but not a great deal of them. And that's one of the, we had a big controversy with Spielberg and Hanks about that, about all the four-letter words that were injected. And their excuse was they couldn't get the rating if they didn't use those words. And he said, yeah. Anyhow, that's an apology that we'd like to have seen that be a little bit, be a little less that swearing, because the series has become almost a standard for World War II in Europe, and a fairly good biography of what happened in a company and how they functioned and all the camaraderie and all the crazy stuff that happened there. So after that, then HBO produced the series, and it's changed our lives forever. My daughter was in Normandy here in June with me, and as they said, I was up on the podium with the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Security. I was really out of my class. But when I came down off the podium, those very VIPs were naturally had quite a crowd, but people were just flocking around me. And my daughter said, "Dad, is it always like this?" And I said, yeah, it is. People come and they know I'm one of the band of brothers, and they just want to get my signature and all that. And most of the guys have been very accommodating about that. There's only 3 or 4 of them that have gone Hollywood on us, but that's going to be the case. But it is fun because I'm able to speak with an audience like you folks, and I'm able to impart to them and give you some messages of things that I think are important. I think the folks that survived the Holocaust have far stronger messages than anything I can do. But I will say, please, please, get your education. Get every bit you can. I came home from service. I never was a very good student, but I did graduate in mechanical engineering and made a very good living, and I had to make a very good living because we had 9 kids. So, and most of my kids have gone to college now, and if I'll digress a little bit here because I think of something. If you don't smoke, don't start. I'm serious. I spent 18 months in a hospital because a guy on a tank lit a cigarette in the middle of the night. And he lit that cigarette. Within 30 seconds, an 88 came in. And I didn't have the presence of mind to really vacate the spot that I was in. And the Krauts were good with 88s. And they used them almost like a rifle at times because they had such a high velocity. They had that muzzle velocity of a deer rifle. So they could shoot flat trajectory right out over a field a couple thousand yards, and they didn't have to have much elevation to come over. And they'd fire one at one guy. And this night, they fired at one little spark of a cigarette of a guy sitting up on top of a tank. It came in, it hit probably, I say, 10, 15 feet away from me. It killed 4 other guys. It blew me off my feet, and when I went to lift my legs up off the ground, I thought they were gone. And I looked, and there were the broken, my legs were dangling, or my pants legs were dangling, and I had my broken end of my femurs I was up in the air with them, and I realized I thought I was dead. So as a good Catholic, I said my act of contrition, and then I said, God, what's my mother going to think? I'm an only child, a doting mother and dad, and an only child. And I stayed awake. And a medic came along and shot me with morphine, and I never lost consciousness to my recollection at all. And they loaded me on a stretcher, And we went out across a farm field. I think it had been plowed in the fall, on a hood of a Jeep, and they hadn't tied my legs down. So my legs were bouncing like this on a stretcher. And I'll never forget that. I was screaming. I couldn't control my pain. Couldn't, just was so. And finally I said to the Jeep driver, hit me in the head with a hammer. Hit me, knock me out, because Krauts were good at sound shots. They had big equipment that they could move around and they could pinpoint a sound, particularly tanks and Jeeps and things like that moving across the field. And I knew that. And evidently decided the target wasn't worth it, so they didn't come in on me, and I got into an evac hospital. Now remember, when we got into Bastogne, within less than 18 hours, we were totally surrounded. 10 German divisions with tanks, with artillery, with everything. All fresh troops, most of them right out of Germany, had been amassing back behind the lines for about a month that our intelligence didn't pick up. And so when they struck a weak point in a couple of divisions of people who had just come up to the line, had no combat experience, and it was a massacre. And that's where so many Americans were captured, 100,000 or something like that. And that was a tremendous blow to two divisions were totally. And we saw those guys come, what was left of them, coming at us that day. And when we did, we stripped them of ammunition, we stripped them of anything that they had that was worthy as far as combat equipment goes. One of the horrible things about the Battle of the Bulge was on Christmas Eve, they bombed the church, which was the hospital that we had all of our wounded in. Now remember, up till that point, and we had been in combat since the 17th, night of the 17th, last morning of the 18th of December. So we had a lot of casualties already. And they were all accumulated in a church in Bastogne, which is still standing today. And they were getting more bombs and shells on them than we were up on the line. So it was not good, but that was the only place they could be. And we had our medical tent that on the night of this, the medical tents or the medical operations group usually tried to proceed the combat units because they tried to get set up in a rear echelon position to be able to receive the wounded as they came in when the combat troops hit the line and the infantry began to sustain casualties. Well, Bastogne was encircled by that time. The German tanks had run around the whole perimeter. And Bastogne was a town, if you ever looked maps on it, that had roads coming in it from every direction, 2 or 3 roads in azimuths, if you ever look at the map. And that's why the Krauts wanted that, because it was a distribution point for them. So, lo and behold, one of the things that happened was an SS battalion overran our medical tent. They set fire to the tent. By that time, the tent had been set up. They were receiving casualties. They slit the throats of the guys that were in stretchers and were helpless, blew up the tent, and killed a lot of people. A lot of the medical people disappeared that night. Some came home. Most of them, we don't know whatever happened to them. They were either buried or they were something. They just disappeared off the face of the earth. In this whole melee, a guy from the 401 came up, and his company commander had said, he was a scout, he said, make contact with the unit on our flanks. So he went to the one flank and came up over a hill, and here's the medical tent burning with all the bodies of GIs all shot or sliced throats and all that. A camera was laying on the ground. He picked it up, and it had film in it, and he started taking pictures. And those pictures were submitted to the U.S. Army after the war was over, or right toward the end of the war. And very few charges were ever leveled at that SS group. No one really knows why that happened, but something should have been done about that. But the whole, and then now the worst part about this was, not the worst, that was horrible casualties. All our good surgeons and nurses and all that stuff were gone. And here we were surrounded, taking casualties every day. So that kind of thing, it sticks with you, and we lived through it. And I'm lucky. I'm very, very lucky, because when I went into surgery that following morning, there were, if many of you seen NASH, the operating rooms in the MASH, that's what it was. This was a vegetable kitchen where they cleaned vegetables for the convent. It was a flying nun convent, and I still remember those nuns running around taking care and making sure that we had blankets, because up until that point I hadn't been inside. I had blankets on but you know, the temperature was probably 20 degrees or something like that. But we hadn't been inside any building at all for 25 days then, so it didn't make much difference. You had acclimatized yourself to what the weather was like. So they brought me into the operating room, and they were finishing up a guy on the other table, and I heard, and that was an electric saw cutting the guy's arm off. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to lose my legs. First of all, when I got hit, I thought my legs were gone, but then I realized that they weren't. So I sat up, and they were holding, it was ether, and the ether mask, the orderly was holding the ether mask, and I looked at the two surgeons. They had their hands up, they were all scrubbed, they had a circle, just like the movies. And I said, "Are you going to take my legs off?" And one of the surgeons said, "No, no, trooper, we don't think we have to take your legs off." And I said to them, "You're not blinkety blank blank blank." And they said, "Nope." And I said, "Okay, give me the mask." So the orderly handed me the ether, and I put it on and passed out immediately. 24 hours later, I woke up, and I was in a evac hospital. And evac hospitals are where they collected the wounded, and guys were dying all around, screaming, hollering, nurses running around. It was chaos, absolute chaos. And a nurse went flying by me, and I knew I had a cast on. It was up to I could feel the cast was up onto my shoulder, my ribs. So as one nurse going by, I said, "Nurse, get that blanket off my toes." I didn't know if I had any toes. And they pulled the blanket up, and I wiggled those 10 toes like that. And I went back to sleep for 24 hours. And the next thing I did, I was hungry. So anyhow, that was part of that. Now, I came over on the Queen Mary. That was pretty good deal, except that we were below the water line on the bow of the boat, and that made a few of us uncomfortable. And I went back home on the Queen Elizabeth, which wasn't bad, but I rode the promenade deck on the way home in a plaster cast. So I'm skipping around because I try to tell you some of the highlights of all the things. When I first came into the company, a lot of people have said to me, "Well, you know, did you get accepted? Were you?" And I said, "You know, I do not recall having anyone haze me or make fun of me or, you know, say, you don't know anything about anything." And so I think the reason was that they needed replacements so badly. Because remember, they had made 2 combat jumps, and both they'd taken their share. When they came home from Normandy, they only had half of the company. The rest were in hospitals or dead. And Holland was pretty much the same way. In fact, in Normandy, before they ever got to the ground, one of our planes blew up, and they lost the company commander and 17 men, whole stick. An airborne stick in those days was a C-47 could hold 17 men in the flight crew. And that plane got a direct hit, and of course they were all carrying all kinds of munitions and dynamite and landmines and all that stuff. And when that plane got hit, it just blew in the air and disintegrated. And if you ever go to Normandy, out and back in Normandy is a place called Boozeville. It's about 3 clicks off the beach of Utah. And there's a monument there to that plane, its crew chief, and the 17 guys, including our company commander, at that point. And that's then when another company commander was appointed, and I don't know, Dick Winters wasn't appointed yet then. I can't, some of this gets a little fuzzy with me anyhow. I had a number of interesting things. McClung was absolutely the best combat soldier any company could have. But when it came to the barracks and, you know, being not in combat, he was absolutely not a soldier. And he conformed with nothing. And the guys all knew it. They all knew it. So just before we went up to Bastogne, about a week earlier, they had a dress parade. Well, you can imagine, our guys had been in combat 70 days. They were literally in tatters. No one had any decent clothing, and McClung was the worst of all. So they knew that they could take care of themselves. McClung would never go out of his way to be in a Class A uniform or have his boots shine or anything like that. So I witnessed this with my own eyes, and I verified it one time when Mac and I were drinking Calvados together someplace in Normandy. So I said, Mac, is this, you know, really, did you really go out of your way to do some of these things? He said, well, I don't think we should have to do this, and he wouldn't. And this is, so help me God. The Friday night before we were settled, getting ready to do a dress parade. Now, if you can imagine, guys just came back from 70 days in combat. They lost about 22, 23 guys, a lot of guys wounded, and we're having a retreat parade. It was almost, almost mutiny. But everyone knew that no one would get a pass because McClung would get gigged for not having a uniform or not having his boots shined or all that. So I witnessed this with my own eyes. The guy'd come up, another private like myself, and he'd say, hey, Mac, where's your blouse? Oh, it's under the bed. So we were in a French abandoned army barracks. Now, you know what a cement floor is that's about 60 years old? It's completely dust. It was laying underneath there, so someone picks it out, shakes it off, takes it, presses it. Someone grabs his boots, presses it, shines his boots, and they got him ready for the parade. No gigs, nothing happened. Came in, we were all back in our bunks. It was a Saturday, so we had no duty. Mac takes off his blouse and drops it, kicks it under the bed. Pants the same way, and I think they're probably there. In fact, one night when Mac and I were drinking, I had a few extra Calvados, I think, that night. And when I say the word Calvados, do any of you recognize what I'm saying? I sort of doubt it. Okay. It's a French apple brandy, and it's got a kick to it like a Cavassier, but it's made of apples, and it's excellent, and it's peculiar to Normandy. And every time I go there, I bring home a couple bottles of it because all my boys have learned to drink it. Drink. In fact, we just had a reunion here in our 66th reunion and our last. And we had all the guys from E Company 2012 there, not all of them. 18 of them came from Fort Campbell. So we all got together and we had a toast to Calvados for all the guys that have not come home from their deployments or not came home with us after the war. But anyhow, Mac, that was the way Mac was, and I sat with him one time, we were talking about it, and I said, you know, Mac, I saw this, and he said, well, you know, I just don't believe in that. This dress parade and stuff when we're in combat and we're out of combat. We're in combat 70 days and we go back and we're going to have to polish our boots and all these things, and that's the way. And today he's still alive, and he was. You know, I've talked to him all the time. We have fun and we stay together. And for those of you who will eventually serve in the military, don't lose track of the guys you served with. They're the only people you can talk to, and they know what you're saying. You know, well, you tell a story and people will nod and all that, but unless you've been there with them, you can't share those emotional things. And this is, I think, and I have a lot of contact with the 34th Division in Minnesota, and I'm very friendly with the chaplain and the commanding general and all that baloney. And one of the things I see is these young men come home from a deployment. They step off the airplane. Some of them are discharged within a month or two of when they come home. And they're back into civilian life, and no one knows what they can't talk to anyone. They can. We used to talk about macabre things and laugh about them. I mean, a lot of people would think we were crazy, you know. It wasn't. I didn't laugh about this, but one time I was sent to get water for the platoon. Now, water was a real problem in Bastogne. Remember, the temperatures were. How close are we here? Okay. We were below freezing weather, and a couple of the nights it got 10 below. Now I'll remind you, when we left Marmelon-le-Grand and rode the trucks to Bastogne, we were never inside of anything, a pig pen, a doghouse, a cow shed, nothing. We were in the woods in our foxholes. And luckily, well, our officers had said, take all the K rations you can get. We don't know what we're going to get into. And boy, were those guys that listened were really thankful, because we didn't have any food for 10 days. And finally, when Patton broke through to us right after Christmas, we got our first bucket of hot turkey. That was like manna from heaven, believe me. So, and when I got hit, my pockets were filled with chocolate bars. From that. Why? Because we got one of those every day. Now, if we ever had to abandon our positions and infiltrate out, because that's we thought we might have to do, because we were scared to death that our commanding general was going to surrender us. Because remember, we had a hospital full of casualties that couldn't be tended to. We were running low on food, ammunition, and and the weather was getting worse and worse, because we were approaching the middle of January, or start right after Christmas. Temperatures started to drop, and we had a few nights that was 10 below, and most of the guys were not equipped for that. I had sewed an extra blanket around my sleeping bag because I'd been on maneuvers the year before, and I knew the sleeping bags were no good for about 30 degrees or thereabouts. But most of the guys didn't have the opportunity to do that, and it was pretty tough. And of course, the boots, you only had one pair of boots, and those boots got wet. And some of us had galoshes. I had rubber boots, and they were just as bad because your feet sweat. Then you go to climb in your bag at night, and if you didn't take your boots off and your shoes off, then you put on fresh socks. You wake up in the morning with trench foot, and your feet were black. And as soon as they were black, they were heading you to surgery for possible amputation of toes or an ankle or something like that. A lot of guys, that happened because of not, when I got hit, I had pockets of chocolate bars, but also around me in every place I could were dry socks. around my tummy, around back, up in my helmet, anywhere where you could put to get body heat, and that's what dried the socks out. Now, they didn't smell too good, but they were dry. And you were putting them into wet boots. So you had to have them dry because in an hour or two, your feet would be wet again. And those were some of the horrendous things that we ran into in Bastogne. So many of the casualties, so much was pneumonia and colds. And, well, just imagine, you're coughing, you're out on outpost, ho, ho, ho. You don't cough or you'll either get yourself killed. So that was my rehab. I came home and I was in the hospital 18 months. And I don't kiddingly say this, but I have had an opportunity to go to a number of hospitals where I've talked to orthopedic surgeons and guys from Afghanistan and so forth that have been wounded and had orthopedic problems with them. And I say to them, why don't we abandon Guantanamo? And they say, well, why? And I said, no, simple. You don't have to question them. You don't have to ask them anything. All you do is put them in skeletal traction. Now, if anyone knows what skeletal traction is, in my case, they drilled holes through both my knees, and they put pins through. And then those pins had a little yoke, and that yoke was attached to a pulley system, and that pulley system had weights on it in order to try and get my femurs to set properly, because both femurs were totally disconnected. Why I didn't get hit with the bat and have my femoral arteries severed, don't know. The Lord was taking care of me. So for 3 months I laid with my feet, my legs up, come and held my hand at night, and they understood the pain I was in, and they couldn't do anything about it because I'd already had my pain pills for the day. 5 minutes? 1 minute. Ooh, I got it. Okay. I came home. I spent a total of 18 months in the hospital, 9 months in bed. I exercised every day, and when they said to me, we think you can try to walk. So I put my feet down on the floor, and I stood there, and they had braces made for me. And I stood there, and they brought parallel bars around, and they were on wheels. And they said, well, you think you can walk? And I said, hell yeah. And I walked across the ward. First time I'd had my feet on the floor in 9 months. And believe it or not, 2 weeks later, I went home on a 60-day furlough. So I've recovered pretty well. I've had a wonderful life. 9 children, 15 grandchildren. Most of them have gone to college. I have a wonderful wife that I met 2 nights before I went back to the school after the war. And I saw her across a dance floor, and I said, I want to meet her. 4 years later, we were married. That's the paratrooper persistence. She dated every one of my fraternity brothers in the meantime, though. And I can't blame them. She's a beautiful woman. So thank you very much. You were a very attentive audience.